Hi, and welcome everyone to Blooducation Baristas. I am your host, Daniela Hermelin, serving you piping hot transfusion news and advanced medicine topics. I'm so excited to be having this podcast today with a friend and colleague, Dr. Aurora Liebig, who is an emergency medicine physician and EMS medical director with Madison Emergency Physicians. She is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine, emergency medicine residency at Washington University in St. Louis, and Medical College of Wisconsin for her EMS fellowship. She is dual board certified in emergency medicine and EMS and serves on the Wisconsin American College of Emergency Physicians Board of Directors and as president-elect for the Wisconsin chapter of the National Association of EMS Physicians. Guys, I'm out of breath. That's a lot already. This is an amazing resume, Aurora. We're here today to be speaking about, as you guys know, hot topic, pre-hospital transfusion medicine. And it's really an honor and privilege to have Dr. Liebig with us today, who is so passionate about this topic, but also it's great to get the perspective of actually another state, right? Because we know that pre-hospital transfusion, although it's federally regulated, it's also very different state by state. And Dr. Liebig has put so much effort and energy and passion into this area, and I'm so excited to now bring her on. Welcome, Aurora, Dr. Liebig. So great to have you with us.
Thank you so much. What a great introduction. I'm excited to be here on your podcast. I had a chance to listen ahead to a few of them, and excited to share some information with your audience as well. So I'm really pumped to talk specifically about Wisconsin and some of the challenges, unique things, but I don't think it's just for Wisconsin. Obviously, you have a broader audience, but I am I'd like to be here to represent some of the more rural areas, some of the community outside of the urban academic centers, because a lot of what we've seen in pre-hospital transfusion and blood programs popping up around the country have been, urban centers and cities. And I am representing kind of more rural communities, many Midwest states and across the entire country. The further out you get from the urban trauma centers and things like that, kind of the lower resourced in general, a lot of our community hospitals as well as EMS services tend to be. That's not to say that they can't be great. They absolutely can. And many of the paramedic services that I work with in particular are absolutely fantastic. And that's why we're really looking to bring emergency transfusion to the field in some of our areas. So very excited to talk a little bit more about that.
I'm so glad that you started out by saying that this is not going to be just about Wisconsin, but sort of an area of the country or even population. We're going to talk maybe about the rural area of the United States. And I think that's great because there's been a lot of questions on where the most value might be in pre-hospital. And I have a feeling we'll see value everywhere, but they're sort of making this claim that maybe we won't see as much value where you're very close to hospitals, whereas in the rural areas where you're very, very far from hospitals, very far from blood products, very far from, quote, healthcare, that this is where we're going to get the most, quote, bang for our buck. I do think that we're going to see it beneficial actually wherever, but certainly there's this discussion about, quote, blood deserts, which is, I think, these rural pockets of the area of the United States and other areas of the world, frankly, that don't have easy access to blood. So maybe you could share with us a little bit about what that looks like from your perspective. I'm sitting here right now in St. Louis, where just a few miles away in any direction, and we have 2 level 1 trauma centers. So what does it look like for you, in your area?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I work a lot on the trauma side in general, not just particularly blood, but every state, no matter what state you are listening from right now, I take a look at your state map as far as distance from a trauma center. Pretty much every state should have some sort of a visual on the level 1 or 2 trauma centers, and then kind of a radius around that. And we hear about the golden hour in trauma, and we can talk more about that another time. But that at least represents a general idea of how far you are from your level 1 or 2 trauma centers. Then as you go a little bit further out, there's generally kind of a map or radius on how quickly maybe a helicopter could get you to a level 1 or 2 trauma center. And we focus on trauma primarily because we have very measured outcomes from that. We understand that this is data that we're collecting from the field in general. And most states are collecting a lot of the serious trauma data so that we have a little bit more information to study this. So in Wisconsin in particular, we have level 1 and 2 trauma centers in Madison. We have 2. And then in Milwaukee as well. And then there's also pediatric trauma centers in both Madison and Milwaukee as well, in both the children's hospitals. And then in the northwest corner of the state, we don't have hard and fast state lines, right, as many states do. So we have a neighboring city. So the Twin Cities has level 1 and 2 trauma centers as well. And then if you're really far in the southeast, you get a little bit closer to Chicago, though mostly they will go to Milwaukee as well. So that leaves, as many of your other states probably have, you have kind of the 2 maybe urban trauma centers, maybe 3. I'm thinking of the Midwest states typically have just a couple. Minnesota has the Twin Cities and Mayo, Michigan, Illinois. You've got your urban trauma centers, but pretty much every state, if you map them out, there's kind of these like areas in between those urban centers and the radius around them that is a little bit more rural, right? So we all take road trips. You're driving through some of these areas. You should care about what happens in those areas, right? Even if you live in an urban trauma center and you're next to an urban trauma center like you do, and a lot of my colleagues do. But I trained, right? So I trained at WashU in a big, busy urban trauma center with amazing, emergency medicine, EMS, trauma, education, and I wouldn't have traded it for the world. It was an absolutely fantastic experience. My heart lies a little bit more in the rural setting, right? I mean, we love tree houses, and my kids are taking archery classes. Like we have a little bit more of a rural lifestyle. And this is the medicine that I chose to practice is more of a community medicine with a suburban / mostly rural focus. And so I do a lot of my education in a way, EMS education, specifically things that have a broader reach, right? So I want to be able to reach some of these underserviced EMS services in the more rural areas that may need a little bit more education, support, and get them excited about what they're doing. So I wanted to lay out Wisconsin as an example, but largely represents many other states. So within every EMS service needs a medical director, a physician who helps write their protocols, who stamps things saying that they're okay to practice at state level. Every state varies a little bit in what that looks like. But I think sometimes, particularly for your audience that may not be living in the EMS world, I think it's a common misconception that EMS will come and they can do all the things and then they take you to the hospital, and not every EMS service is even going to be able to do blood transfusion. So Wisconsin and most states have different levels of EMS, and they practice within their scope of practice. So again, you can look up for your individual state. What is your EMS scope of practice? So for example, a first responder might be basically trained kind of like a police officer, right? They can stop the bleed, they can do CPR. It varies a little bit, but that's essentially what a first responder is. EMT basic is kind of like a semester at a technical college, and they can do a little bit more. We can give EpiPens and oxygen, be trained a little bit more, but it's a semester of education. And oftentimes in states, it varies a little bit more as far as intermediate. We used to call it IV Tech, intermediate EMT, advanced EMT, for example. It's more like 2 semesters at a community college, and they'll do IVs, maybe a little bit more, and medications and things like that. None of those levels that I just talked about can, in most states, transfuse blood, which is fine. Oftentimes they can establish IV access and ask for a neighboring paramedic service to come by, and that's really where we get a lot of a reach with the potential for transfusion, is how far are they from a paramedic level service, and can we empower those paramedics to have excellent trauma care and transfuse blood. We still provide, there's a lot of trauma care in particular that can be done really well by EMT basics and first responders, right? Stopping the bleed, keeping them warm, extrication if they're involved in a really difficult crash where maybe they're stuck, or there's safety concerns, for example. Our first responders are fantastic at that, and as well as even some of our medical patients need to be taken out of a really difficult home with a steep staircase where they need to get out. And so there's a lot of EMS medicine that happens before the point where we have like an IV transfusion. You were thinking about hemorrhagic shock. But the paramedics in particular, so there's often paramedic and critical care paramedic kind of levels within different states, and the scope there varies pretty significantly in what in what each particular state can do. So in Wisconsin, for example, our paramedics have a scope of practice that you can Google. You can look up exactly what that is. It changes slightly every year to year as we add or improve upon the scope of practice that they can practice within. Typically, there's a group of physicians and EMS leaders that help guide and decide that at the state level within each state. So Wisconsin added blood into the scope of practice for paramedics last year, and that really kicked off the opportunity for us to do that. So we can look into it, we can suggest it, but until it's within their scope of practice, which is the key word for each state, we can't do it. It's not permissible at the paramedic level. Now, you may have a physician response vehicle where, as a physician, we have a much broader scope of practice. That physician then could take a vehicle out and transfuse blood. Similar to flight services. Flight services often will be carrying blood. They can land in more rural areas. And for many, many years, that was really the only opportunity that a patient would have in the field to get a blood transfusion was, can the helicopter come or not? So whether a helicopter can fly, so I flew with Flight for Life, which is based out of Milwaukee for a period of time. We have really fantastic flight services in Wisconsin, I have to say, really quality focused, safety focused. Several MedFlight in particular flies physicians, which is a little bit more rare over the last 10 years or so. Maybe even a little bit more. There's been fewer and fewer physician-based flight services. We have physicians in our area and that will land on scene and be able to do all the trauma care essentially that we could do in the emergency department. They bring a fast exam, blood transfusions, we've got TXA, and a lot of other trauma kind of package we can bring to that patient's bedside, which is fantastic. However, we all know that helicopters don't fly all the time. They can't get to every position, so every location. So that really paints a picture of complexity within our rural areas. Mm-hmm. Who is responding? When can they get there? How far from a trauma center are they? What kind of first responders or EMTs are going to be at that patient's side? Is there a paramedic service nearby that can either respond initially or come to mutual aid or help out that initial responding service? And then does the state have a scope of practice that allows blood transfusions in the field? For some places that can be kind of a regulatory nightmare and you got to go through all these state, governmental red tape processes and stuff like that. But I would argue that it is very worth it. If your state doesn't have it in scope and you're listening, please, work on that. There's lots of great opportunity to read up and see what other states have done. And I think it's definitely worth it, because it's a huge hurdle for us, is whether or not it's in scope of practice.
Mm-hmm.
Then you really have to have a involved medical director. There's and a leader within your EMS agency that can kind of take this on and be a champion for their service, because it is a lot of work to set up, right? So there's equipment and purchasing and funding, protocols, safety. The temperature monitoring needs to be quite robust, obviously, and I feel like I'm not the best one to talk about that. Like you guys know exactly what we're talking about, but at the same time, how that fits into an EMS agency and how we can do that incredibly well and be really proud of the quality that we maintain within an EMS service. That is something, how we apply that to the field, to each agency, what that looks like within each agency to make sure that we have excellent quality within that, great QI practices, ongoing education. That's really where my expertise lies. And not every EMS agency has an EMS fellowship trained physician. There's more and more of us. I'd say within each Midwest state, at least, there's somewhere between 12 and 50 EMS physicians. And we're all out there sharing our protocols. Our protocols with Madison Emergency Physicians, MEP, are public. We share them. There's EMS agencies across the state that we don't even provide medical direction for, that we share our protocols with. It's not a secret. We want all of Wisconsin to have excellent, high quality, evidence-based protocols. So yes, as we're building up our blood protocol, for example, that is going to be shareable across the state. And I think that is really important, because as we're working on things that may be more novel within your state, understanding what other agencies are doing that is really high quality practice, evidence-based medicine, and understanding kind of what your neighbors are doing and how we can implement this together is going to be really important as we move forward.
Yeah.
So at the time that we started this project, there was no other EMS agency in Wisconsin that was actively giving pre-hospital blood transfusions. And certainly
when was that? When you say about the time you started, when was that? What year was that when you started thinking about this?
Yes, this is a long endeavor. So we started, I would say, probably a year and a half ago. And for listeners out there, the paramedic agencies that I work with are still in the planning and early implementation phase. So we are submitting to the state our protocols. You guys heard us talk about our protocols and procedures, but the biggest hurdle was the state scope. So I think 4 years ago, I came to this particular area, and one of the paramedics that I had worked with actually before I went to medical school, worked as an EMT, and I worked with him, and he emailed me and said, "Hey Doc, I'm so excited for you to be in our area. We're, can we give blood?" I was like, whoa. Awesome idea. I love how excited you are about this. I love that you care about the patients in our area and making sure that they get excellent quality care in our rural setting, because we see this stuff, they see people literally I don't mean to sound dramatic, but bleeding to death on the side of the road.
And where did this young man see the how did he get this idea? Where did he even come to ask you about it? Was he in the military, or had he seen other EMS providers do this in other states?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's a movement out there within EMS education called FOAM, which stands for Free Open Access Medical Education. So you can go on social media sites or even Google and do hashtag FOAM EMS, FOAM EM. And that connects EMS and other learners to kind of free open access medical education. And that's a great segue into how we give EMS education, because EMS in general is not a well-funded entity. EMS is funded a few different ways. There are some private agencies that operate kind of with a profit margin from billing and things like that. But many EMS agencies, certainly most of them around us, are funded from municipal, from your taxes, right? So you should know wherever you are in the country listening to this right now, learn about how your local EMS agency is funded. And maybe you have overlapping ambulance agencies if you live in a more urban area. In many places, it's your local town, city, county that's funding that. And there's not a lot of extra funds to go around. So when it comes to things like education, buying a blood cooler or a few blood coolers, buying, a warmer for transfusion, even investing in something like blood, that is a significant barrier for a lot of places. Impossible? No. In our state, there's some extra funding that the state provides, understanding that EMS agencies are financially limited. So that comes to education as well, which I appreciate when we do podcasts like this. It reaches some of those folks that they're less likely to go to some of the paid courses and a symposium where they have to travel and pay for it because it's probably not going to be funded by their EMS agencies. How we reach EMS really helps with that. I also work with him on our tactical, so I serve as the EMS medical director for a tactical team, a county-based tactical team in our area. So we do a lot of TEMS training, and we're out there in our vests and working with our law enforcement officers. We've got like the armored Bearcat and things like that. And you better believe they're very interested in having blood transfusions available for maybe an officer or a patient on scene who sustains a gunshot wound in a tactical environment. And this is, we have a lot of evidence that guides us, right? Particularly from the military setting. But this applies everywhere. And I would like to think that we can bring just as much high quality trauma care, including pre-hospital blood transfusions, to those folks, even if we're in a rural area and we're 2 hours away from a level 1 or 2 trauma center.
Yeah, I have so many questions for you. Okay, the first one is, you mentioned how you actually started as an EMS. What level were you? Did you say you spoke about all the different tiers, but you started out, before you went to medical school. And I really loved how you laid out all the different sort of steps, or how would you say it, almost like compartments necessary to think about even starting or implementing a program. And you talked about both scope of practice, but the different types of EMS healthcare workers, from a police officer to a medical director. In your experience, do you think all levels could be educated to transfuse blood? Do you think that would be a safe practice? And or because of the rural limitations, it almost should be almost like forced because of the limitations of how many people, can access an individual? Just throwing it out there.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's great. So I started out as a basic EMT. So 1 semester at a community college, actually, while I was going to undergrad, and then in the afternoons, I would totally overachieve stuff. But yeah, go to like UW-Madison classes for my bachelor's in the morning, and then EMT classes after classes all day. I'd go to more classes. This is what we do.
And what drew you to do that? Why were you loved it?
Yeah, sheer ambition. I don't know. No, I really liked the idea of volunteering. So I will tell you kind of my initial, and many of your listeners can probably relate, but I was like, what could I do to volunteer somewhere that will help me pay my application, get into med school, things like that. And like, I did some other volunteering, HIV groups and helping out elderly folks and whatever. But what really interested me was actually my local hometown volunteer EMS agency.
Wow.
And how cool that I got to go on the ambulance and kind of see patients that way. I was also a nursing assistant, so I had, some touch on that. But I bet there's a lot of folks out there listening that maybe had something similar to that, where they had a little interest. I thought, maybe I can volunteer for this. Maybe it's good for some, my resume or a career building ladder, things like that. I absolutely fell in love with it. I had amazing mentors. We were a volunteer agency, yes, but I'd like to think that we were a really high functioning, well organized, quality focused EMT agency and all volunteer at that point, but you know, it really helps when you see EMS done well, and then maybe you see EMS done not as well, and you're like, wow, we really need to make sure that we maintain quality everywhere, right? When you cross district lines or county lines, you don't want the quality of your pre-hospital care to go down because of the limitations that many EMS agencies face, you know, funding, staffing, quality. You know, in order to do a blood transfusion in the field, we need to make sure that we're doing it safely, right? And that is a huge, the safety, the monitoring, you know, temperature monitoring, quality, education, that kind of stuff is a pretty high bar for a lot of EMTs. So I think as a volunteer EMT, or even the next level, which then I went on to do IB Tech or a advanced EMT, which is a little bit different in every state, but kind of that next step of towards, you know, towards increasing your scope of practice in EMS. I feel like we were pretty awesome volunteer, basically advanced EMT agency. And I don't think that we could have really done this in the high quality way that I think that we need to maintain EMS in the field. There are some places that may have a more intermediate scope between basic EMT and paramedic that maybe in their state that makes sense. And so I'm not saying no. I would say basic EMTs, no. Like one semester at community college is just not enough to make blood transfusion safe. And also most places don't even have placing an IV within their scope of practice. So this really needs to be an advanced, and certainly I think the minimum at this point, at least in our state, is paramedic. Absolutely. They have 2 years of you know, depending on the program, about 2 years of education at a community program. There are some more accelerated programs out there, but they have all the cardiac, you know, recognizing early anaphylaxis, you know, all these different medications, pressors, things like that, that's within their scope of practice. And so in order to do blood transfusion and do it well and do it safely, right now, I think paramedic is the paramedic and beyond is kind of the scope of EMS where I feel like blood transfusion belongs. Maybe in the future, we can look into more advanced services. But that would be the option. Also, you know, some states, I'll use Maryland as an example, have a statewide EMS scope of practice. So everyone in Maryland follows the same protocols, the same, you know, they do the same thing. When they change things, they change as a state. Most states are not like that. Most states will have kind of a menu of things. Some things are required for you to eat. Some things are optional. And so that menu essentially is the scope of practice. And in order to force someone to eat one of those menu options, there has to be a really robust understanding of what those EMS agencies can do and can afford. Whenever we change something within the scope of practice, and I mean meaning like there's a state medical director and a board and, you know, all of these other folks, it's certainly not up to me. When they change something, we have to think about the financial implications on our EMS agencies. So, for example, the startup cost for a small agency to do blood with a cooler, the warmers, the education, all of that kind of stuff might be $10,000 to $20,000, and that would be a huge hit. Like the operating budgets for most smaller rural EMS agencies are nowhere near where they could just be like, "Yep, sure, no problem, I can come up with that." That would be a really big hit for most agencies, and so I think the required element is not quite there. I would like for this to become the norm, and so that's why we're, you know, building and sharing our EMS protocols, hopefully serving as an example to more rural agencies. I'm super excited that my colleagues in Milwaukee have recently started field transfusion, so that's fantastic. I was a little like, dang, we didn't get to it first, no, but this is a multi-year process for us, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to have worked with you guys at Impact Life. I mean, this has been fantastic because initially I started the process about 2 years ago, talking to our local hospitals, which, you know, everybody's a little bit different, but their services will, you know, they get their blood products through you guys through Impact Life, and ultimately it's your guys' blood, and to be able to work with you guys directly is really helpful. But in the community, you pick your average rural county in anywhere in our country, and they may or may not even have a hospital within that county, right? I mean, we certainly have neighboring EMS, neighboring counties that don't have a hospital, and they have to drive 30 to 40 minutes to the nearest community hospital.
Mhm.
So, partnering with something that's more regional, like your blood bank, I think is a great option if you're able to do that. So finding who to talk to, how to connect with those is a big initial barrier. But I think starting with your paramedic agencies, your medical directors, the leaders within that, and connecting, just making those connections. Just like that paramedic reached out, hey, he saw an opportunity, reaching out, and yes, it took us a few years, but we're there now, and I'm super excited to be starting this within our area. I think it's going to be a huge opportunity for our rural citizens.
Thank you, by the way. It's a pleasure to be able to work with you, and our blood center offer life-saving products for pre-hospital transfusion. I think that as this grows, our partners will grow, and I don't think one model is going to work. And I'm excited to see how hospitals, blood centers, EMS, we work together to create almost like consortiums, to help each other, especially as we think about recruiting donors and decreasing or limiting wastage of products. I just recently saw this incredible webinar it was Lieutenant O'Brien, I think from Maryland, like you mentioned. They have this dashboard that just blew me out of the water. So if we could kind of share those special innovation that's happening, and like you said, but in our conversations, what seems to be challenging is what you were saying, to change the scope of practice actually at the state regulatory level. Can you share with us what that looks like? I mean, I don't think you went to medical school to be a politician. I didn't, but I find myself being more and more involved in Capitol Hill advocacy. I never used these words before. So what does that look like for you to get involved, and how challenging is that? In Missouri, I don't believe they had to go through that many hoops as you are going through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's such fun. So it is going to vary, obviously, state to state, but I think Wisconsin is pretty similar to other states. So we have a medical director at the state level who is an EMS physician, and currently our state medical director is my fellowship mentor. He's fantastic. I think he's doing great things for the state. It's a pretty intensive thing where and I'm sure this is similar to other states too, but you choose to be a state medical director, all of a sudden you have to deal with all the state level, kind of meetings and treasury and things like that. It's a lot of red tape and, regulatory challenges and things like that. And then our state in particular, and I think many others, have a physician advisory council that helps alongside the EMS board. And the EMS board is made up of a lot of EMS professionals, paramedics, EMS educators. So we have things, little subcommittees that work hard on things like education, quality, maintaining scope of practice, addressing scope of practice. And the physician advisory council, or maybe there's a group of physicians or a couple of physicians that may advise your state medical director, but they're really the decision makers. So they're the ones that, we, as those of us who are not on that committee or not the state medical director, usually there's an opportunity for us to speak up, to, raise our, essentially constituents, right? And I could be on the physician advisory council, and I probably will be in the future. For the last 10 years or so that I've been in Wisconsin, one of my direct colleagues has always been in that seat. And so I have been saved from saved from the voluntold service that sometimes these are. But at the same time, it's really important to have well-educated people that really understand the EMS system in those seats. So several of my colleagues and EMS physicians serve in those, and they do a fantastic job. It is a lot of work. It's a lot of meetings and red tape stuff, but it's important work. So I work a lot on things that you can't work on as much when you are in a official state capacity, which is more on the representative group and advocacy side. And I find that's a really effective approach to some of this. So I work on Wisconsin ASAP, which is our emergency medicine group, and EMSP, which is the EMS, National Association of EMS Physicians group. I serve on our local RTACs, which is a regional trauma coalition that I'm sure a lot of, if not most states have as well. And yeah, we try to make regional practices, shared education. We do advocacy, absolutely. Have met with, put in my fancy suit and met with a lot of our lawmakers and sat in a lot of, congressional offices advocating for various different things in emergency medicine and EMS, not just trauma related, but it does help to be part of the local trauma systems as well. I find that a lot of local change happens at that kind of grassroots level. And so they're all great ways to be involved and to do things like increasing scope of practice. But really, I think what drives us at the core, like, would we tolerate all of this state scope, like all the meetings and the treasury and the minutes and the, talking about the same thing for like years at a time? Would we tolerate that if we didn't have that internal drive? I don't think. What drives most of us is that we care so deeply about the patients that we serve, right?
Yes.
We care about each other in EMS. It is a hard field. It's hard. We see hard stuff, from our 911 dispatchers to law enforcement. We see messy, ugly, sad stuff all the time.
Yes.
We see really great stuff too, but we see really sad stuff, whether we have maybe we have a home birth. We have a lot of like rural population. We have, and there's a lot of people do Amish and plain folks as well. The plain population, and as we get more into our rural area, a lot of sad traumas. We had, I don't want to be too specific and patient focused, but we've seen, kids that are crushed or pinned under a tree. We've seen, women with postpartum hemorrhage. These are hours away from a trauma center, hours. Bad motor vehicle collisions where it takes, up to an hour or more even to get somebody out of a vehicle to be extricated. I do a lot of ride-alongs with my EMS agencies. As a physician, I, jump in the supervisor vehicle and ride along with them to scenes. And it's a good reminder of what I used to see in EMS and what drives us. And so I've absolutely been on the scene of some of those really difficult. I think of one that was a semi driver who, just like many other states, we've got a major interstate that runs through lots of semi traffic, and we also live in Wisconsin, so we have snowstorms, icy roads, and people that aren't paying attention. That's ubiquitous across the entire country, right? And so we had a while ago, we had a semi driver who hit a disabled vehicle on the side of the road and went off into the ditch. And the semi driver, the cab was almost unrecognizable, but there was a still alive human in that vehicle, and he was conscious. It took probably over an hour to extricate this gentleman. Super sad. He survived, but it was cold, which we all know is bad for trauma. We weren't even able to access an IV. So could we have given him a transfusion while he was, pinned in the cab? No. But we were able to give some intramuscular. We could access just enough of his body to talk to him and give him IM injections of pain meds and things like that, and basic monitoring. So, you know, we could access like an IO, could have transfused, but we didn't have blood at the time. So this is a really, I mean, he very narrowly survived. But those are the kind of things that, I mean, it could happen to any of us, anywhere, driving, you know, taking that road trip through a rural area. This is why we need, you know, this is what drives us to do all this advocacy stuff, to serve on these panels and things like that. So, you know, I would encourage anybody out there, I know I'm kind of speaking to the EMS crowd a little bit, but I have a strong interest in EMS wellness and things like that. And I'd really encourage people, if you've had some of those sad, frustrating, hard scenes, to channel those big feelings into things like improving your local EMS, your statewide scope of practice and education, not just where you are, but everywhere that you can have a reach. I didn't talk about it here, but I also serve on the ITLS editorial board, so the International Trauma Service. And so we do a lot of, you know, education and writing chapters and tests and things like that on an international audience. So for an international audience. And so thinking about scope of practice in other countries
Right.
is a whole different challenge. And there are absolutely, we were talking about blood deserts before this, blood deserts, there's trauma care deserts, there's education deserts, and how do we reach those folks to improve trauma care in a way that they can understand and afford and is in their language. That's a whole other level of reach that I work on as well. But in the meantime, we're doing what we can in our local area, which is improving trauma care and blood transfusions in our own backyard.
Right. Beautiful. I mean, I always say charity starts at home, but I love the fact that you are helping both from a local to a global level. And I think what our idea of community has changed because of, you know, having access to social media and the internet. Our communities are global now too. So it's amazing the education and what you provide. I couldn't even remember every committee you're on. That's incredible how all the things that you're involved in. And we're very blessed to have you really focus your passion and kind of lift this up. I'm curious, as you're so close to implementation, how do you calculate or think about how much blood products you'll need and what those blood products will look like? I know that EMS is and ED and trauma, they love whole blood. Oh my gosh, whole blood, right? But I think that there could be a place for component therapy, right? So red cells, liquid plasma. And we have new products coming out that might also be very advantageous for our EMS partners to help with storage and transportation, like freeze-dried or spray-dried plasma or platelet products. So just wondering, you know, how you're coming to think about how would you, or how are you starting to, you know, look into your population and try to assess what your blood product needs are. And I just want to, you know, you did discuss a lot about the traumas that occur sort of on the highways, but also we do see a lot of medical bleeding. So those obstetrical hemorrhages that are occurring. So tell us how you go about thinking of, you know, about the blood products and where to transport them or how to store them and etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to also credit some of our EMS agencies in Missouri that were already doing this because, like I mentioned earlier, when we started on this journey, there were no other EMS agencies in Wisconsin. We had just gotten it in scope of practice. I had this, you know, excitement from my medic agencies and our tactical teams that about doing it, but we didn't have anyone in our state. And so I, in my grassroots energy, decided to just start cold calling some of these other services. You know, I trained at WashU. I had a friend, Jeff Siegler, that I think you know well, who's an amazing EMS physician, also from WashU. So reached out to my friend and colleague and kind of started cold calling some of these EMS services that are doing this in a similar area. Like I said, if you're looking at doing this in your area, I think find another agency that is similar to your size and geography and reach out to them. Just call them or email them, try to get their contact information, say, hey, I'm so-and-so, I work in this place, and we're a paramedic agency that's a couple hours from a trauma center. Here's our general call volume. And tell me about how you guys implemented this. How does it go? What's your, volume like, your storage, your QI processes. Just most places I think are going to be really excited to tell you, and huge credit to the agencies that I spoke with, because they took time out of their day to to talk to this essentially random person that was a friend of a friend kind of a thing. It's like, hey, I know your medical director.
Or I want to pause there to say that this has been my experience as well, and one of the reasons why I love being a part of this whole phenomenon is that everyone just wants to help everyone. Everyone is in the mindset of, trying to share, grow, optimize, innovate, so the people who are involved in it's all about what you said before. It's about keeping that patient care focus central. And how I've seen this happen. Oh my gosh, I don't want to be in this situation again. How can we do better? And I'm just thrilled. I feel like I'm on the periphery, even though I get so many nice compliments. Thank you so much but really, I'm watching you guys from the sideshow, from the sidelines. And yes, everyone is so helpful in this. So please continue. I was just wondering, and maybe this is a silly question, but how do you know that this next person is going to be roughly your same size, or is a similar program? Does that take a few calls as well? Or is it based on the city size or how would you?
A little bit. You can kind of speculate based on geography without knowing anything about these other services, right? I saw a rural service that was an hour and a half outside of a major city center, i.e. St. Louis. We're pretty, the cool thing about EMS, and one of the things that really drew me in initially as a volunteer and, drove me through medical school and residency and EMS fellowship and what I do now, is EMS is a family. We really are. It's wild. I mean, I'll go to trainings nationally, meet up with somebody, and we have so much in common that we instantly are friends and colleagues, and you can work through challenges. We have such similar challenges everywhere. So when we go to these national conferences like NAEMSP, the National Association of EMS Physicians, we are talking about that same thing exactly. How are you doing this, and what are you doing, and what were your challenges? And that really helps. I think when we look at, circle back to your original question and tie this in together, we look at our call volume in general. That can give you a general idea. Do you have 5,000 calls a year, or 20,000 calls a year, or 1,000? The service that I volunteered for had 1,000 calls a year, and so the opportunities to transfuse are much fewer. And that is, another challenge that we have when you look at rural services is depending on who you are giving this for. So most of the time we're talking about trauma and medical hemorrhagic shock. And we can talk about the details of the protocol later as far as how we define that and, timelines and things like that. But if a patient is in hemorrhagic shock in the field and they meet their protocol criteria, we essentially look backwards as far as we went back for 2 years of data with each of the EMS services. And I would say, the other important element of this, not just for an involved EMS medical director who can do the education and oversight of this program, is champions within each EMS agency. Not one person can do this on their own. If you are one person within your EMS agency and you're looking at starting this up, find allies, find your friends. Yes, you can look at the data for the last 2 years. We used, for example, you just looking at trauma alone doesn't cut it. Your search terms needs to involve some element of hypotension. We use TXA administration as a marker, for example, to identify some of those cases, because often who we're giving TXA to is it can be a surrogate for our severe trauma patients, hemorrhagic shock. then also medical, right? So postpartum hemorrhage, GI bleeds with signs of hemorrhagic shock and hypotension, those other things that would not qualify for something like TXA as a marker. So we had to search in multiple different ways, but I have great medics within each agency who serve on a lot of times our education and QI, CQI processes that are able to kind of dig into the data either with me or by themselves, and then we review the data together. And that gives us a general idea, because I think it's important for a service to recognize if you're really rural, you very well may have the benefits to an individual patient for giving a unit of blood, for example, say packed reds or whole blood or wherever they are in the country and what they plan on doing. But to be able to give that to a patient is helpful. If you think you have such a low volume service that you may only do that once a year or twice a year, and, depending on if you can cycle that blood back in to reduce waste with your local hospital or something like that, you don't want to be wasting all those blood products. And so maybe looking at a regional approach, is there a medic agency within the area that will be able to have a ground response within 20 or 30 minutes or something like that, where you can have more of a geographic reach on the ground? That's some important considerations. Is going to be very geographically specific for each place. But what's interesting and I think is so cool about our particular region is our paramedic agencies actually work really well together. So if there's EMS people out there listening, they'll know what I mean. But not every EMS agency is friends with their neighbors. This is very much like a neighborhood. Sometimes your neighbors get along great together. Sometimes your neighbors don't want to play nice. They don't want to talk to each other. They don't want to share. Your local fire departments and EMS agencies, maybe to some degree have some rival or something like that. It's weird. We should all get along, yes, but that does exist. I think we're a little bit exceptional because we're implementing in our area is 3 rural, semi-rural and suburban EMS agencies that have really high quality paramedics and critical care paramedics. They work really nicely together. And so when we were looking at implementing this in our area, kind of all 3 together are working together to work on, purchasing, fundraising, what are you doing, protocols. And that really helps because, for example, if we have I'm just going to use trauma as an example again. If we have a patient who has severe trauma, so say we had a construction worker pinned at the site, and he was there for a period of time and was showing signs of shock. I use the pinned example because those are patients that can't get to that, even if the helicopter is sitting next to them, right? Like they cannot get out until they're safely extricated. And so they're stuck in that position. And an ambulance on the ground is arguably the best way to get them the best care at the location that they are and hopefully prevent death, right? So we would have, for example, collaborating agencies that could respond. So maybe agency A responds to that patient, and then they start, all of that excellent trauma care, start extricating the patient, and then they call in backup in agency B, and you could potentially have, 2 units transfused, depending on, everybody's going to be a little bit different with what they carry and everything, whether they're carrying blood and plasma, 1 unit, 2 units, everything's going to be a little bit different for different agencies out there. But this is a way that we've looked at to collaborate, to reduce waste. We're using things like, maybe you look at your local flight services and say, what warmers do they use? What equipment do they use? Is that compatible with what we're using? Talk to your local hospitals, make sure your blood tubing, your education, everything like that. Everything needs to be pretty streamlined. So it's not just the one EMS agency. Think about your neighboring agencies. Think about your collaborating hospitals, your trauma center, and your community hospitals. They all need to be on the same page with this. And use your local resources to kind of build that team, start gathering allies to move this forward.
Wow. So at first, you kind of provided us with some simple approach, which is figure out how many calls you have a year, and then maybe use certain indicators, or how would you say it? Keywords to pull out from your database to figure out the need to transfuse per those respondent calls. I know that some agencies might even use the ISS score, because I'm not sure if some agencies are able to pull out keywords like trans TXA. I don't know. What I've found is maybe there's a little bit of an over expectation. And once you actually go live, we learn that you don't need as much blood, but it could probably depend from agency to agency. But then you move towards something that I didn't think about, which goes back to a constant theme, which is collaboration. So in the rural setting, you may have a certain amount of calls, but you may not see as many patients or respondents that require blood products unless you expand to other EMS agencies. And if that is the case, there needs to be a collaborative effort. And you have to put that into your calculation, but then it also requires a collaborative theme, which, depending on your neighbor, may work. But again, I hope that the blood center can offer that ability to tie people together. I'm hoping that that can be the role also, that the blood center can help to expedite, which is we have these relationships with the hospitals because we're the blood supplier, and we have the relationships now with EMS. Let's pull everybody together so that we can have that conversation. So hopefully we can help to support each other. But it sounds like it can be a challenging calculation to do in a rural setting. That's a little different than an urban setting.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, most urban services maybe have like a city fire department based EMS, maybe private EMS agencies that are funded a little bit differently or have collaboration with each other. But when we get into a rural area, it really is it's very different. It's very different. I mean, in northern Wisconsin, kind of northern, north central, and northeast Wisconsin up towards the UP, we have some pretty sparse areas, like entire counties that may only have one physical ambulance that may or may not be a paramedic. So really, when we talk about things like getting blood to those essentially blood deserts, it is like 25 steps down the line as far as what we need to do to be supporting them to do that. Even things like, I serve as a medical director for one of our EMS programs in our state that happens to be one of the biggest ones, and doing great education to build great paramedics to get them in the field, doing advocacy to make sure that our EMS and paramedics are fairly compensated. Because if we don't do that kind of base ground quality building blocks as EMS medical directors and EMS professionals that are out there kind of hoping to improve EMS care, if we don't do that, we're not going to get to the high quality, safe blood transfusion in the field that we need to. So there's a lot of EMS medicine that obviously I feel very passionately about, but it's a lot about building that quality building blocks. And EMS has long been kind of, I don't want to say forgotten about, but neglected as a healthcare profession. Yeah. I mean, they're under the Department of Transportation nationally. This is like, they're not just ambulance drivers. You want to make an EMT really upset, or I call them an ambulance driver. They don't like it. It's kind of a running joke, but they are so much more. And when we're talking about giving them these higher skills, again, with really high quality education and ongoing continuing medical education and monitoring and safety focused practices to make sure that we're doing it safely.
Oh yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, also I'm coming from the perspective of pathologists and a blood banker. So, I mean, everything you said just resonated with me, is that we have to be anchored in education and providing evidence-based practices, and that we have to develop very, very good standards, which are about to come out soon from ABB. But
I'm excited.
Yes, me too. Following those practices. And like you said, you keep repeating this word quality system. Sometimes, I'm not sure if broadly we understand that concept from a pathologist perspective, it may look or feel different than from EMS, but it's, creating an infrastructure that we make sure that what we do is accurate and precise and is safe. We have just a few more minutes left, and you've covered so much, but I want to leave with education because I see you're so passionate about it. What do we need most right now in developing educational systems for pre-hospital transfusion? And if you had a magic wand, what would that look like?
That's a great question because it can be multifaceted. The first thing that came to mind is low cost and easily accessible, because that is what reaches EMS, and particularly when we're talking about our more rural agencies, low cost and easily accessible. So, we live in a digital age. Post-COVID, we're doing things like this, virtual podcasts. And that is the kind of stuff that can really, really help out, increase the reach and quality of the education. Would we love to be in person at every agency? Absolutely. But it's hard as an EMS educator that's trying to maintain both quality and quantity and reach, geographic reach. And you'll see that within, Minnesota has a great rural consortium for some of their more rural northern and northwest. They've got a group of physicians, EMS medical direction, that provide kind of a consortium among that area. And that's absolutely fantastic because a lot of those EMS agencies, maybe they don't have a doctor in their county at their community hospital that's able to help them with this, right? I mean, we still have emergency departments that are staffed, by family practice docs, by, and PAs, hopefully with some direct physician supervision. But, there's not always that person who can be a good quality pre-hospital medical director and understand the complexities of that. So, and EMS physicians, we've only been a boarded subspecialty for maybe 10 years or so. This is fairly young. So I think that if we could have, my ideal, if I could design it, would be a series of education, one with how to build from a rural perspective, how to build from a urban perspective. Urban, there's a lot of great examples across the country. There is not a lot for the more rural EMS agencies. And so how to think about it, kind of a checklist, if you will, having that great foundation as far as education, the right people, an involved EMS medical director, ideally, and then also talking about kind of next steps. So equipment, what's out there at the time. And that's kind of an evolving thing, right? Where we're brand agnostic, but we want to make sure we have quality equipment. So looking at AABB approved, devices and things like that, so that people aren't just hoping for the best, putting it in whatever cooler and hoping for the best. That probably hurts all the blood, all the transfusion medicine folks out there.
Well, the good news, Aurora, is that from our perspective, blood center, is that you could use whatever equipment you want as long as it maintains temperature. And so there's, ones with bells and whistles, and then there's a simple one that you could probably store your lunch in. But as long as it does what you say it should do and that you could point to it, you're good to go. But again, what I see so much that I think is incredible is the innovation coming from the fields of emergency medicine. And I think it's lifting transfusion medicine up a notch because of, what we're able to do and accomplish, especially with equipment, with monitoring, with tracking. So a lot of data, digital systems. And then of course it could turn into blood product innovation as well. Also, they're talking about maybe even using drones to carry blood. So that might help also in the rural setting. But when you think about, it sounds like, okay, it would be awesome if maybe we had even more programs or focus at the physician level and then at the EMS level. But what specifically do you think needs to be trained in terms of topics? Where do you think that there might be gaps in learning?
I mean, with the blood transfusion, pre-hospital transfusion, that alone has its own subset. I think that's the obvious part, right? Like understanding why and who and when and how. That to me is fairly easy, to make and roll out in a way that can reach folks. But I think maybe the less recognized thing that is really important is having high quality CQI and safety standards within an agency. So many bigger agencies like big fire departments within a city, they probably have a quality and safety officer. Awesome.
Yes.
Smaller agencies probably don't, right? They
Right.
may, I hope they do, they should, but they should have one person who maintains quality, who checks the charts and makes sure that their patients with chest pain got aspirin unless there's a contraindication to otherwise. Make sure that all of the boxes are checked, that people are following protocols, maintaining a quality program for monitoring. We have entire courses for physicians to do this, but I do feel like it's a gap. It's an opportunity in EMS services, particularly smaller EMS services, because they're not trained in CQI, quality and safety.
Right.
But it is necessary in order to do something like this safely.
Yeah.
So whether they're monitoring their call, setting up a CQI program within a more rural or smaller agency, that is so important. So important. I would say that if you don't have something like that, or at least a person who is educated and willing to do that for monitoring, to make sure that the patients who are getting blood are the right patients, that we're doing safely, all of that is necessary. And not every agency has that. And I would say if you're a rural agency out there listening and you think about, can I do this? Man, it sounds so great. Like we're hours away from a trauma center and I want to be able to give blood transfusions. I feel like whether a patient on the side of the road or in their house gets a blood transfusion when they're in hemorrhagic shock shouldn't depend on the weather, whether the helicopter's flying or not. If there's a winter storm, I still want them to have great quality patient, evidence-based care and get what they need to potentially save their life. And that's where I feel like the need is there. There is definitely kind of a palpable excitement out there about this in EMS and the pre-hospital environment, which is fantastic. But do not neglect, do not forget the importance of having a really good, kind of safety program, CQI officer within your individual agencies, and then maintaining ongoing CME, essentially medical education. So we implemented ultrasound, for example. So we do the rollout. It's a big kind of tall ask as far as time and education, but also the ongoing education. We have to make sure that we keep training on it. Things are going to change in transfusion medicine and elsewhere. And so maintaining that ongoing education is key as well, and definitely needs to be built into a program.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I do think you hit the nail on the head. I think that then brings up another challenge, which is how do you pay for this person? How are you able to cover that cost? Because that takes a lot of time and effort. And again, to make sure that person is skilled and trained in being that quality manager. But I think that is essential, and it's going to drive the practice. You covered so much in this hour. I think we could probably talk for another hour, but maybe we'll just leave with some finishing thoughts on this. Aurora, what didn't we cover that you say, I got to get this message out there?
I would say that I feel like the academic centers, which no knock, I love my academic centers. I chose to be a community physician, and there's kind of a dichotomy as physicians graduate from medical school, go through training, and there is a lot of the evidence-based medicine and excitement, just like every other topic, tends to really live in that academic space, and it's kind of rolled out into those areas sooner. And that's great because we get to use that as how does this apply to my more rural area? But I think that particularly for this one topic, for pre-hospital transfusion and patients in hemorrhagic shock, we have so much more opportunity. I mean, we're potentially an hour or more away from a trauma center. This really needs to reach a broader geography. And so putting that, kind of translating that from the academic and urban centers to the more rural setting, which often involves your community emergency medicine or EMS physician. This is so important. We are going to save lives with this. We just need to figure out the details and make sure that we're doing it safely and that we're reaching the right people. So that would be my closing thought, I guess, is I want to encourage places, if you think that you're too small, too rural, don't have the right stuff in place, work on building that up so that you can implement a program like this. And because the patients who are farther from a trauma center deserve excellent, high quality pre-hospital medicine and care, and implementing a pre-hospital blood program is a great opportunity. And I'll be excited to maybe we can circle back after a while and after we've started this up and talk about some of the challenges as well, because this is the information that I'm not seeing a lot of out there, and I'm excited to be part of it and to be sharing with you all.
We are so blessed to have you in our community and all that you do. I have no doubt that we'll be back talking, because what's so great is you said what we need education on is implementation. Well, maybe in a few years that's done. We know what coolers to use and how to track. So now it's just, adjusting and making this better and thinking about other innovations, right? So I totally think that you'll be back talking to me to tell me the next phase of education. But I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you to our listeners for joining us. And, I hope that you just continue to have much success in all that you do. And really, you spend so much time and your passion in moving this forward. And we are so grateful. So I wish everyone a beautiful holiday season, happy and healthy New Year to everyone. And I have no doubt we're going to see just continued progress in this area in 2025.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Hermelin. Everybody listening, thank you for caring about EMS, and we're all here to work together to improve pre-hospital medicine.
Wonderful. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.